Welcome back to the Complete Idiot's Guide to Philosophy. Today we'll be talking about the school of the Milesians, that is to say, the first three philosophers in recorded history. The first of which would be Thales, the guy I was talking about in my other video who predicted the solar eclipse. His first attempt at philosophy was a stab at the question, what is stuff? What is the world made of? What is this? What is this? What am I? I don't know. So his explanation for all this was water. He thought water was the shiz knight. He thought it was everything. And this is understandable considering that, where he lived, Miletus, the city, was surrounded by water on all sides. And, hey, you gotta drink water to live. And, water can be frozen into a solid and it can evaporate into a gas. All this cool stuff about water. He's like, oh my gosh, I love water. It must be the coolest thing out there. It must be the very foundation of reality. Yea, it must be what the gods themselves are made of. Yeah, he really liked water. So I think that actually partly answers my first question. What was Thales' basic question? What was his answer? What reasons might he have to support his position? Yeah, he thought that, water, you need water to live, so it's pretty understandable that people at that period in history might think that it has some serious significance to reality because you have to drink it to live. Question number 2. How does Thales explain change? Well, his answer is a little funky if you ask me, but it's understandable. It was an honest attempt to get at the truth, so he thought things were full of gods. That is to say that he believed that any, like when he looked at magnetic stones and how they were able to move metal or iron, he thought that was like some kind of causal agent, that there was like some kind of power that was inert in the stones that allowed them to move, so that the movement came from the stones themselves. And so he explained it in the only way he knew how. He said that the stones were full of gods. Little tiny gods. Midichlorians. Now I know where George Lucas got that from. So yeah, that was his explanation of change. And of course there were other things like, if he was a material monist, a believer in water, which means that any explanation he can get to support his claim must have something to do with how water changes. Like, what is the significance of water evaporating and turning into a solid? So that was his explanation of change. The next question is, what is metaphysical monism? Why could Thales' position be called material monism? Well, I was just touching on that before. Metaphysical monism, well, I should just say what monism first. Monism is the belief or the position that says that one principle can explain everything, that there is one universal truth or lens to look through that explains everything. Mono, one, monism. Makes sense, right? And the Milesians were metaphysical monists. That is to say, they were material monists. They all believed in one thing, one particular thing, that was typically a material substance that could be the basis of explanation for everything. In Thales' case, it was water. He was a material monist for water. And the fourth question is about his apprentice, Anaximander. What does Anaximander mean by the apeiron? Now, Anaximander is actually the most fascinating of the three, in my opinion. I like his stuff. I really like his ideas, even if they've been kind of, made obsolete, whatever. His explanation for the world was that everything came from a more boundless fundamental reservoir. Apeiron in Greek means boundless or infinite. It's infinite. It's like Ouroboros. It was his explanation for where everything came from. It's kind of like a primitive attempt to understand the laws of conservation of matter. Everything comes from something. He believed that there are so many different opposites in the world, so many different things, that they all can't come from each other. They all have to come from something completely unseen, something that's not purely, but mostly theoretical. So, me, myself being a Christian, I couldn't help but think that the apeiron was almost an explanation of God, a boundless reservoir from which everything else comes. Yeah, I don't know, I thought it was interesting. So that's the apeiron. The next question is, how does he explain change? Well, again, he believed that everything came from the boundless, the apeiron. Again, there are so many opposites in this world. He believed that everything was about warring opposites, like hot and cold, and fire and water, and all these different things. And when we get change, it is the outcome of the clash of these opposites. And he believed that since these things were all so different, they all had to come from one fundamental source. Number 6. What is the basic substance according to Anaximenes? Anaximenes. This guy I don't like so much, but hey, I'm not here to be biased, I'm just here to go over the facts. Anaximenes believed that the primary substance was air. He liked air. He liked it a lot. Again, it makes sense because you need air to breathe. Just like Thales believed you need water to live, you need air to live too, understandable. Anaximenes, he thought, it's everywhere. You can't escape air. No matter where you go, you're always going to find air. It's there. So it makes sense that he believed it was the all-encompassing, thing. According to Anaximenes, what two principles explain change? Well, again, since he's a material monist, he can only explain reality through what happens to this substance that he worships. Well, not worships, but So the two things that happens to air are rarefaction and condensation. That's what happens when air expands or contracts, stuff like that. So, not much else to say. I mean, he also noticed that when you breathe softly on your hand with your mouth open, it feels kind of warm, right? And yet when you blow on it with your lips pursed, it's more cooling, right? So, he wondered at stuff like that. And those two principles about what happens to air were his explanation for change. And lastly, number 8. What points of agreement were there among the Milesians? Again, these guys were all monists. They all believed in one thing that could explain everything. Now granted, Thales and Anaximenes were material monists, in that one believed in water, the other in air. Anaximander did not believe in something that was a material substance. He believed that it all came from something a bit more transcendent, I guess. And from these early philosophers, we can see that the schools of empirical and rational thought were born. Thales and Anaximenes both come from a very empirical sort of standpoint. They look at these things that can be sensed and touched, and they gather information from that. They believe that the best way to arrive at knowledge is through sense. That is what you can see, taste, touch, smell, hear. Whereas Anaximandor is more a rationalist. He believes that you can arrive at knowledge through that which can be rationally explained, that which can be, logical. And, these are all very crude attempts at empiricism and rationalism. But we give them credit where it's due because, at the time, philosophy and science went hand in hand. They were almost the exact same thing. So half of figuring out what reality was figuring out, well, what's the world made of? Basic science stuff. And considering what these guys had to work with, they did pretty well. That's all I've got on the School of the Milesians. There will be more next time. Thanks for watching. Go do something productive. Get off YouTube.